coming up because we're diving into some seriously wild territory today. CIA, mind control, LSD. It's like the stuff of Cold War spy thrillers, you know.
Yeah.
We're about to unpack declassified files and Senate hearing transcripts from the 70s that exposed MKUltra, a top-secret CIA project.
What's fascinating about MKUltra is that it reveals a lot about the anxieties and ambitions of the Cold War era.
It really does.
It also raises important ethical questions about scientific research and government overreach that are still relevant today, even now.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's start with the basics. For anyone who maybe hasn't gone down this rabbit hole, what exactly was MKUltra?
Well, we have to start with the program's origins in the early 1950s. The CIA was under immense pressure to combat not just traditional warfare, but this new psychological front.
Right.
Imagine the intel reports landing on their desks, whispers of Soviet and Chinese agents using mind control on captured American soldiers during Korea. They had to believe it was possible, had to find a way to counter it.
So initially it was about defense.
Yeah.
Understanding the enemy's playbook, so to speak.
Precisely. The initial focus was understanding these rumored techniques, primarily to develop countermeasures for their own operatives. It was about protecting their own from being turned into weapons, into unwitting double agents. But then, as often happens with such endeavors, the lines began to blur.
That's what makes it so unsettling.
Yeah.
What starts as defense can easily morph into offense, especially when you're dealing with something as powerful as the human mind. What triggered that shift with MKUltra, you think?
A combination of factors, really. Part of it was the desire to understand if these mind-altering techniques could be used offensively to turn the tables. Imagine the potential they saw, extracting information from resistant subjects, discrediting enemies, maybe even influencing them to become double agents themselves.
Yeah, the possibilities, while disturbing, must have been, tantalizing from an espionage standpoint.
Absolutely. And you have to remember, this was uncharted territory.
Right.
The science of the mind was still in its infancy, and the CIA, with its vast resources, saw itself at the forefront of this new frontier.
Oh, for sure.
But of course, that lack of scientific and ethical boundaries is where things become truly concerning.
And speaking of concerning, the documents mention LSD quite a bit. What role did it play in MKUltra?
LSD quickly became central to their research. They were particularly interested in its potential as a truth serum, a way to dismantle a person's inhibitions and make them divulge secrets willingly. Remember, this was the era of covert operations, of needing every advantage in the intelligence game?
And LSD, with its ability to alter perceptions and loosen grip on reality, probably seemed like a shortcut to unlocking those secrets.
Yeah.
Did they have any success with that, or was it as unreliable as it sounds?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one that continues to fuel debate. Early on, they experimented with giving LSD to witting subjects, including, surprisingly, their own personnel. They wanted to understand firsthand how the drug impacted behavior and thought processes.
Okay, before we go down that rabbit hole, I have to ask, dosing their own people, what did they think they learned from that, and what were the long-term consequences?
That's where it gets complicated. They believed that by experiencing the effects themselves, they could better understand its potential for interrogation or even for enhancing creativity and problem solving. Of course, we now know how unpredictable and potentially damaging LSD can be, but back then, their understanding of its long-term effects was limited. It's this lack of oversight, the potential for abuse, that makes MKUltra so chilling in retrospect.
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to reconcile that kind of experimentation, even on willing participants, with what we know now about informed consent. But the idea of unwitting subjects is a whole other level of disturbing.
It is. And that's where a case like Frank Olson's, truly highlights the ethical abyss MKUltra fell into.
Right. Olson's story is one of the most well-known tragedies linked to MKUltra. For those unfamiliar, he was an Army biochemist working at Fort Detrick, where, as we now know, some of these experiments were taking place.
And in a tragic turn of events, he became an unwitting participant in one of their experiments. In 1953, Olson was at a retreat with colleagues when, unbeknownst to him, he was given a drink laced with LSD.
Yeah, the documents suggest his reaction to the drug was severe, and just 9 days later he falls to his death from a hotel window in New York City. It's hard not to see the connection there.
Exactly. Officially, his death was ruled a suicide, but the circumstances surrounding it were incredibly suspicious, even back then. His family has always maintained that he was murdered, perhaps because he posed a security risk after the LSD experience.
Makes you wonder, if the goal was to control minds, what happens when someone becomes uncontrollable or worse, a potential liability?
Precisely. Years later, Olson's body was exhumed, and a second autopsy revealed injuries consistent with a blow to the head before the fall. While the debate continues, it lends credence to the theory that Olson's death was no accident. His case, even with its lingering questions, became a chilling example of MKUltra's potential for horrific consequences.
And LSD was just one avenue they were exploring, right? The files also mention things like hypnosis, electroconvulsive therapy, even paralytic drugs. It's like a laundry list of mind control experiments gone wrong.
It's important to remember that the CIA during this period wasn't solely focused on one, magic bullet for mind control.
No.
They were casting a wide net, exploring every possibility, however outlandish. Their pursuit of mind control wasn't limited to substances. They were equally fascinated by the potential of techniques like hypnosis, believing it could be used to implant commands or extract information from unsuspecting subjects.
It sounds like they were pulling from both science fiction and maybe even some darker chapters of real-world history for inspiration.
You're right to make that connection. MKUltra wasn't just confined to labs and covert safe houses. They contracted research projects with universities, hospitals, research institutions across the U.S. and Canada. Over 30 institutions were involved, often unwittingly caught in this web of clandestine research.
It's staggering to think about. So many people, knowingly or not, entangled in this web of secrecy. And this wasn't just about observing the effects of drugs, right? There are mentions of safe houses set up in places like San Francisco and New York City. What purpose did those serve in all of this?
Those safe houses were essentially controlled environments where the CIA could experiment more freely, away from the prying eyes of the public and even their own government.
Wow.
They would lure unsuspecting individuals to these locations, sometimes using prostitutes as bait, according to testimonies, and dose them with LSD or other substances under the guise of, say, a social gathering or a paid study.
So they were essentially preying on people's vulnerabilities, their desire for connection or even just a bit of extra cash. It's a complete violation of trust on multiple levels.
And what's even more disturbing is that this wasn't limited to willing participants who perhaps knew the risks involved. There's evidence to suggest that MKUltra extended its reach to more vulnerable populations. Mm-hmm. Prisoners, patients in mental health facilities, people who, because of their circumstances, were easy targets for manipulation and exploitation.
It's a chilling thought. And speaking of chilling, the documents also mention Dr. Ewan Cameron and his work with something called psychic driving. What can you tell us about him and his role in all of this?
Dr. Cameron was a prominent psychiatrist at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. He was a leading proponent of a theory called psychic driving, which essentially involved trying to erase a patient's existing memories and personality traits and then reprogramming them with new thoughts and behaviors.
That sounds less like therapy and more like something out of a dystopian novel.
The methods he used were just as alarming. Cameron would put patients into drug-induced comas, sometimes for weeks at a time, and then subject them to relentless audio loops of specific phrases or sounds, the psychic driving part. He also employed electroshock therapy, but at levels far exceeding what was considered safe or therapeutic at the time.
I can only imagine the trauma that must have inflicted on his patients. It sounds more like torture than treatment.
The tragic part is many of Cameron's patients were admitted for relatively minor conditions, like anxiety or postpartum depression. They were utterly unaware that they were being used as guinea pigs in a CIA-funded experiment with potentially devastating consequences.
Did any of this actually work? Did Cameron achieve any lasting psychic driving? Or was it all just cruel experimentation under the guise of science? So with all this talk of mind control and truth serums and psychic driving, did it actually work? Did MKUltra ever achieve what it set out to do?
That's the big question, isn't it? And the answer from what we can piece together from the surviving documents seems to be, well, a resounding no. Despite pouring millions of dollars and countless man-hours into MKUltra, the CIA never managed to crack the code of mind control. No magic bullet, no foolproof method for turning people into puppets emerged from this dark chapter of research.
Which, I guess on some level, that's reassuring, even if it's a small mercy in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
Right? But even if they ultimately failed, the fact that they were willing to go to such lengths to experiment on people, often without their knowledge or consent, it raises some some serious ethical red flags.
Absolutely, yeah. MKUltra, it represents a colossal ethical failure. It forced a reckoning, albeit a belated one, within the scientific community and intelligence agencies about the limits of research, the importance of informed consent, and the very real dangers of unchecked power, especially when it comes to exploring something as potent and personal as the human mind.
And yet no one was ever held accountable for the abuses committed under MKUltra.
Sadly, you're right. The destruction of most MKUltra files in '73 under the direction of then CIA director Richard Helms, it created, a convenient fog of deniability. It's a classic case of missing evidence, making it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to hold individuals accountable for wrongdoing.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, was the destruction of those files simply an attempt to cover up embarrassing failures? Or were they hiding something even more sinister, something they deemed too dangerous to ever see the light of day?
It's a question that has haunted researchers and journalists and armchair historians for decades. And it speaks to the enduring legacy of MKUltra, the mistrust it engendered, the conspiracy theories it spawned, and the lingering sense of unease about what truly went on in those clandestine labs and safe houses.
MKUltra, I mean, it seems to have, infiltrated popular culture as well, movies, books, even video games. Do you think this fascination stems from a fear of the unknown, or is it more about the allure of the forbidden, the desire to believe that somewhere, someone might actually be capable of controlling our minds?
It's probably a bit of both. The idea of mind control taps into our deepest fears, the loss of identity, the violation of our innermost thoughts. No. But it also plays on our fascination with power, the seductive possibility of influencing others, of bending them to our will. And culture, despite its failures, serves as a constant reminder of how thin the line can be between scientific curiosity and dangerous overreach, between pursuing knowledge and exploiting the very essence of what makes us human.
It's a sobering thought to end on, but an important one nonetheless. MKUltra, despite its cloak of secrecy, ultimately reminds us that we must remain vigilant about protecting our freedoms, our right to think for ourselves, and our ability to question those in power, no matter how shadowy their motives might seem.
Well said. And perhaps by dragging these dark secrets into the light, we can learn from the mistakes of the past and build a future where the human mind, in all its complexity and resilience, remains truly free.
It's definitely a story that I think will stay with me. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.